what if the hallway you were walking down stretched longer the farther you went? What if the hospital you entered contained rooms that shouldn't fit within its walls? What if the staircase you climbed led somewhere that couldn't exist in our reality? Tonight we're going to talk about Silent Hill's impossible places, spaces that defy the fundamental laws of physics, geometry, and reason itself. Close your eyes if you'd like. We're going to move slowly through this, examining how Team Silent crafted environments that shouldn't work, that violate every principle of Euclidean geometry, and that create horror not through what they contain, but through what they fundamentally are. This isn't about the monsters that lurk in Silent Hill's fog, though they'll appear in our discussion. This is about the spaces themselves, the architecture that bends in ways architecture shouldn't bend, the rooms that connect to other rooms through doorways that violate spatial logic, and the town that exists in multiple states simultaneously without any of those states properly aligning with each other. Silent Hill understands something that other horror games often miss, that the scariest monster isn't always a creature you can fight. Sometimes the scariest monster is the room you're standing in, the street you're walking down, or the realization that the building you just entered is geometrically impossible, yet somehow perfectly, terrifyingly real. The places we're going to explore tonight operate according to rules that aren't our rules. They exist in configurations that our minds struggle to process. They create spaces where up might not lead to up, where walking forward might bring you back to where you started, and where the very concept of distance becomes negotiable. These are the impossible places of Silent Hill, and they represent some of the purest cosmic horror the series has ever produced. The locations Harry Mason walked through in the first game seemed like a normal town at first. Shops, schools, hospitals, the infrastructure of ordinary American life. But even in the fog world, before the full otherworld transformation, something was wrong. Streets didn't connect the way they should. The geography refused to make sense. You'd walk 3 blocks north and somehow end up south of where you started. The town's layout operated according to dream logic rather than cartography, and no amount of careful mapping could force it into coherent geography. When the air raid siren sounds and the world shifts to the other world, Silent Hill drops all pretense of following our reality's rules. The school becomes a cage of rusted metal and chain link. The hospital transforms into an industrial nightmare where walls weep blood and corridors stretch into impossible distances. The amusement park twists into something that was never designed for human enjoyment. And finally, nowhere, a location whose very name announces that it doesn't exist in mappable space, a labyrinth that couldn't be built because it defies the fundamental principles that govern how structures occupy three-dimensional space. This transformation isn't just aesthetic, it's ontological. The other world doesn't simply look different from the normal world. It operates according to different physical laws. Gravity works differently. Space folds in ways space shouldn't fold. Distances refuse to remain consistent. You can walk down a hallway for what feels like minutes and cover what should be 20 feet, or you can walk for what feels like seconds and somehow traverse what should be miles. Time becomes elastic, stretching and compressing according to rules that have nothing to do with clocks or the rotation of the earth. The cosmic horror of these spaces lies not in their ugliness or their danger, though both are present, but in their impossibility. These are places that shouldn't be able to exist within our universe's framework. They violate the principles that allow us to navigate reality with confidence. When you can't trust that a door will lead where it appears to lead, when you can't rely on distances remaining constant, when the very shape of the building you're in refuses to conform to physical law, you've entered a realm of horror that operates on a deeper level than any monster could achieve. Midwich Elementary School serves as our first major encounter with Silent Hill's impossible architecture. From the outside, it appears to be a standard two-story school building, the kind of structure you could find in any small American town. But step inside and the wrongness becomes immediately apparent. The school is too large. The corridors stretch too far. The number of rooms you encounter couldn't possibly fit within the building's exterior dimensions. This is a subtle horror, the kind that works on you gradually rather than hitting you all at once. You're moving through what should be a comprehensible space. A school, after all, is one of the most mundane and mapped environments in human experience. We all went to schools. We all learned to navigate their hallways and classrooms. But Midwich refuses to behave like the schools in our memories. The floor plan doesn't make sense. Rooms connect to other rooms in configurations that violate the building's external shape. You find yourself in the eastern wing, but the windows show you views that should only be visible from the western wing. The courtyard you glimpse through one set of windows appears in three different sizes depending on which corridor you're looking from. The clock tower puzzle exemplifies this impossible geometry. You're collecting medallions from various locations throughout the school, and when you finally assemble them and place them on the clock, the mechanism activates something deeper than simple door locks. The clock doesn't just tell time, it controls space itself. When the hands move, portions of the school reconfigure. Doors that were locked become unlocked not because you found a key, but because the space behind them has changed. Rooms that didn't exist before suddenly appear in places where you're certain you've already searched. The clock is doing something to the school's geometry, bending it according to principles that have nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with some deeper, stranger logic. When you descend to the boiler room, which shouldn't exist because the school appeared to be built directly on ground level with no basement, you're entering a space that the building's exterior dimensions explicitly deny. The staircase goes down too far, the basement is too large, and when you reach the bottom and encounter the split-head creature attached to its ritual circle, you're standing in a space that physics insists cannot be there. The otherworld transformation of Midwich makes these impossibilities explicit. The school becomes a cage of industrial nightmare, all rusted, metal grating, and chain link fences. But it's not just that the materials have changed, it's that the space itself has reconfigured. Hallways that were straight in the normal version now angle in ways that hurt to look at. Corners aren't 90 degrees anymore. The ceiling and floor don't remain parallel. You're navigating through geometry that should collapse under its own impossible angles, but it doesn't. It holds together through sheer will, or perhaps through the will of whatever force created it. Rooms stack on top of each other in configurations that couldn't work. You climb a staircase and end up lower than where you started. You walk through a door and find yourself in a room you already visited, but it's different now, mirrored or rotated, or stretched in dimensions that your eyes struggle to process. The otherworld Midwich isn't just scary because of its rust and blood aesthetic. It's scary because it's showing you a building that exists in violation of every principle that allows buildings to exist. This is cosmic horror in its purest form, not because there are gods or tentacles involved, but because you're confronting the reality that the rules you thought governed existence are negotiable. The universe doesn't have to work the way you thought it did. Space doesn't have to behave according to Euclidean geometry. Buildings can occupy impossible configurations, and you're inside one, trying desperately to navigate through angles that shouldn't connect to each other, but somehow do. Alchemilla Hospital takes the impossible architecture to another level. Hospitals are spaces we understand implicitly. They have emergency rooms, patient wards, examination rooms, surgical theaters, all arranged according to strict codes and practical necessity. Medical facilities follow rules. They have to. Lives depend on proper navigation, on being able to move quickly from one department to another, on layouts that make functional sense. Silent Hills Hospital doesn't care about those rules. The normal version of Alchemilla already contains hints of the wrongness. The directories don't match the actual layout. The fourth floor supposedly contains psychiatric wards, but when you get there, you find examination rooms that should be on the second floor. The elevator serves floors that the building's exterior insists don't exist. You can see the hospital from outside and count the stories, but inside, you can access sub-basements that would place you dozens of feet below the foundation, impossibly deep for a structure built on bedrock near a lake. Lisa Garland, the nurse who helps Harry navigate the hospital, seems aware of these inconsistencies without being able to articulate them. She tells you where to find things, but her directions don't quite work. She says take the stairs to the third floor, turn left, second door on the right, but when you follow those instructions, you end up somewhere completely different. It's not that she's lying or mistaken. It's that the hospital's geography shifts between when she gives you directions and when you execute them. The space is unstable, reconfiguring itself according to rules that have nothing to do with architecture. The storage room puzzle demonstrates this instability perfectly. You're searching for a specific key in a room full of shelves, and as you search, the room seems to expand. The shelves multiply, the back wall recedes. You're certain you've checked that corner already, but the corner has moved. Or perhaps a new corner has appeared that wasn't there 30 seconds ago. Time spent in that room becomes difficult to track. You might spend what feels like 5 minutes searching and emerge to discover 20 minutes have passed on your watch. Or you might feel like you've been searching for half an hour, only to discover that 2 minutes have elapsed. Then the otherworld transformation occurs, and Alchemilla becomes something that couldn't exist in any universe governed by our physical laws. The walls aren't walls anymore. They're membranes of rust and decay that pulse with organic rhythm. The floors are metal gratings suspended over darkness that extends infinitely downward. You can look down through the floor and see nothing. Not basement levels, not foundation, just void. Darkness that goes on forever, suggesting that the hospital isn't resting on ground at all, but floating in some empty space that shouldn't be accessible from a town in Pennsylvania. The corridors in Otherworld Alchemilla stretch impossibly. You walk down a hallway that the normal version established as being maybe 30 feet long, and in the other world it extends for what feels like hundreds of yards. The doors along the corridor multiply. There are far more examination rooms than there were in the normal version, far more patient wards, far more storage closets. The hospital has expanded internally, while its external dimensions presumably remained constant, meaning the space inside is larger than the space outside, a geometric impossibility that the hospital accomplishes effortlessly. The worst part is the feeling that the hospital is aware of you. The corridors seem to reconfigure themselves to lead you toward specific encounters. You need to reach the pharmacy on the second floor, but every path you take leads you back to the same intersection, over and over, until finally the hospital decides to allow you passage, and suddenly a door that was locked moments before opens freely. The hospital isn't just a passive space you navigate, it's an active participant in your journey, guiding you, trapping you, forcing you toward confrontations it has selected. When you finally descend to the basement, to the sub-basements that shouldn't exist, past the maintenance levels and the storage areas into spaces that have no official designation on any floor plan. You're entering the hospital's true nature. Down here, the pretense of medical facility has been abandoned entirely. The rooms are ritual spaces, occult chambers, areas that were never meant to heal anyone. The depths of Alchemilla reveal that the hospital has always been something other than what it presented itself as, and that otherness includes spatial configurations that violate every principle of how buildings occupy space. The examination room, where you confront Alessa or a manifestation of Alessa or a memory of Alessa, the game never quite clarifies, exists in a state of quantum uncertainty. The room is both large and small simultaneously. The walls are close enough to touch, but also infinitely distant. The ceiling presses down oppressively, while also soaring away into darkness above. You are trapped in a confined space and lost in a vast emptiness at the same time, and both states are equally true, equally real, existing in paradox that your mind struggles to process. This is the cosmic horror of Alchemilla, not the nurses with their parasitic controllers, not even the monsters that lurk in the rusted corridors, but the space itself. The hospital that exists in violation of geometry, that occupies more internal volume than its external dimensions allow, that reconfigures itself according to will rather than physics. You're inside a building that shouldn't be able to exist, and the wrongness of that existence seeps into every moment you spend within its impossible walls. The otherworld streets of Silent Hill demonstrate impossibility on an urban scale. When Harry steps outside into the transformed town, he's entering a space that violates geography as fundamentally as the buildings violate architecture. The streets don't connect properly. The fog that shrouds everything isn't just dense water vapor. It's a curtain that hides the fact that the town's layout no longer makes sense. In the normal fog world, you can still pretend the town is following conventional geography. Yes, the streets seem to loop back on themselves strangely. Yes, certain areas feel larger than they should be, while others feel compressed. But you can rationalize these discrepancies. Fog distorts perception. Fear makes distances feel different. You're simply turned around. The fog world allows you the comfort of denial. The other world streets offer no such comfort. Here, the impossibility is undeniable. You're walking down a straight road, and the road curves without curving. You're certain you're heading north, but somehow you arrive at a location that should be to the south. Compass directions stop meaning anything. The concept of straight ahead becomes negotiable. Most disturbing are the places where the street simply ends, not at an intersection or a dead end, but at nothing. The pavement continues for a certain distance, and then there's void. Not darkness, not buildings blocking the way, but absence. The street terminates at a boundary where reality stops. You can stand at the edge and look into that nothing, and the nothing looks back with an attention that makes your skin crawl. These voids aren't empty space. They're actively empty, aggressively absent, holes in existence that create suction you can feel pulling at you even when you stand several feet back from the edge. Navigation becomes a nightmare. The map Harry finds is useless once the otherworld transformation occurs, because the map depicts a town that follows Euclidean geometry. The actual otherworld Silent Hill doesn't. Streets that the map shows as parallel might actually intersect. Distances that should be consistent stretch and compress. You can walk from the hospital to the shopping district, and it takes 5 minutes, then walk back following the exact same route, and it takes 20 minutes. Time and space have decoupled from each other, and both have decoupled from any reliable framework. The alleyways are the worst. In the normal town, alleys are simply service paths between buildings, narrow, unpleasant, but comprehensible. In the other world, alleys become spatial traps. You enter an alley that you can see leads from one street to another parallel street, maybe 50 feet away. You walk down the alley and it extends and extends and keeps extending. The buildings on either side stretch impossibly, their walls continuing far past where they should terminate, and the alley between them grows correspondingly longer. You're walking down a 50-foot passage that has somehow become 500 feet, then 5,000 feet, and the parallel street you could see from the entrance has receded into distant unreachability. If you turn around and try to return to the entrance, you discover it's equally distant behind you. The alley has expanded in both directions simultaneously. You're trapped in the middle of a space that was small enough to cross in seconds but has inflated into something vast. And the only option is to continue forward, hoping that eventually the alley will release you, which it sometimes does and sometimes doesn't, depending on variables you can't identify or control. The chain link fences that appear throughout the otherworld streets serve a dual purpose. Functionally, they block paths and force navigation through specific routes, but symbolically, they're doing something more interesting. They're making the impossibility visible. Chain link is transparent. You can see through it, and what you see through the fences in Silent Hill's otherworld streets often doesn't make sense. You look through a fence and see the next street over, except the buildings on that street are upside down. Or you look through and see the same street you're standing on, as if the fence were a mirror, except your reflection isn't on the other side. Or you look through and see nothing at all, not buildings, not fog, just empty space that shouldn't be visible because there should be town there. The fences reveal that Silent Hill's otherworld isn't simply a transformed version of the normal town. It's a space that's wearing the town's shape without actually following the town's structure, and the fences let you glimpse the void underneath. There are moments when you catch glimpses of other people moving through the otherworld streets, distant figures visible through the fog, too far away to identify. But these figures don't obey consistent physics. They walk on walls. They move through buildings as if the structures weren't there. They appear to be traversing the same streets you're on, but according to completely different orientations, as if gravity works sideways for them, or as if they're experiencing a different version of the town that overlaps with yours without quite aligning. This suggests something deeply unsettling about Silent Hill's otherworld, that it might contain multiple contradictory geometries simultaneously, each valid, each real, each navigable by different individuals who never quite interact because they're existing in different spatial frameworks that happen to occupy the same location. You're alone in these streets, not because no one else is present, but because everyone else is present in their own impossible geometry that you can only occasionally glimpse through the gaps. The buildings in the other world don't have consistent interiors. You can enter the same structure through different doors and find completely different internal layouts. The hardware store's front entrance leads to a space that's recognizably a retail environment, shelves and aisles and checkout counters all present in distorted form. But the back entrance to the same building leads to what appears to be someone's apartment, and the side entrance leads to a space that looks like an industrial facility, all conveyor belts and machinery that has nothing to do with hardware retail. 3 different interiors in a building whose exterior is only large enough for one, and all 3 existing simultaneously without contradiction because the other world doesn't care about our rules regarding how buildings work. You can experiment with this if you're brave or foolish enough. Enter through the front, navigate to where the back exit should be, exit through it, and you're in the appropriate back alley. Walk around the building to the front entrance. Enter again, navigate to where you just were, and the space has changed. It's not the same interior you just traversed. The other world rebuilds the building's interior between your exit and re-entrance, or perhaps it maintains multiple simultaneous interiors and selects which one to present based on variables you can't detect. Either possibility is equally impossible, equally horrifying. This fluid architecture means that backtracking becomes psychologically devastating. In most games, if you need to return to a location you visited earlier, you simply retrace your steps. The location will be there, unchanged, except for perhaps some minor differences to reflect story progress. In Silent Hill's Otherworld, returning to a previous location means navigating to where that location used to be and hoping it still exists in a form you can recognize. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you arrive at the correct coordinates on your useless map and find that the building you're looking for has been replaced by something else, or has vanished entirely, or has transformed into a structure that shares the same exterior but houses a completely different interior. The lakeside amusement park represents impossible architecture at its most openly hostile. Amusement parks are spaces designed to be slightly disorienting. The crowds, the noise, the rides that spin and drop, but they're disorienting within carefully controlled parameters. The paths loop back on themselves deliberately, forcing you past concession stands and game booths. The layout is manipulative but comprehensible. You can map an amusement park. You can understand its geography even while getting lost in it. Silent Hill's amusement park doesn't want to be mapped or understood. The normal version of the park, which Harry visits before the final otherworld transformation, already contains hints of spatial wrongness. The carousel is in the wrong location. You can see it from the entrance, seemingly close, but walking toward it takes far longer than the distance suggests it should. Perspective is broken here. The carousel appears a certain size from the entrance, suggesting it's maybe 200 yards away, but after 5 minutes of walking directly toward it, it hasn't gotten appreciably larger. It's remaining visually distant despite your forward progress, as if the space between you and it is expanding at the same rate you're crossing it, keeping the distance constant through some impossible mechanism. The roller coaster that loops around the park's perimeter creates navigation problems that shouldn't exist. From any given point in the park, you should be able to orient yourself by identifying where you are in relation to the coaster's track. But the track doesn't maintain consistent spatial relationships. You use the coaster as a landmark, determining that you're standing on the western side because the track is to your east. Walk 100 yards north and check again. Now the track is to your south. Walk another 100 yards east and the track is to your north. The coaster track is somehow encircling you from all directions simultaneously, which would require it to form an impossible knot of overlapping rails. Yet when you look at the structure, it appears to be a normal single-loop coaster with a clear, traceable path. When the otherworld transformation occurs, the amusement park becomes explicitly impossible. The rides aren't just rusted and broken, they're geometrically wrong. The Ferris wheel rotates in multiple directions at once. Its gondolas trace paths that should intersect, but don't, each one occupying its own trajectory through space that somehow avoids collision with the others despite the trajectories clearly overlapping when viewed from certain angles. The wheel itself appears to be a flat circle when viewed from the front, but impossibly deep when viewed from the side, as if it occupies more dimensions than the three you can perceive. The funhouse, already a space designed to distort perception through mirrors and tilted floors, becomes something far worse in the other world. The entrance is normal sized, a doorway you can step through easily. But once inside, the space expands in ways that violate the building's external dimensions. The corridors are too wide, too long, too numerous. You count the rooms you pass and they number in the dozens, but the building's exterior is maybe 50 feet on each side. There's no way to fit dozens of rooms into that footprint without making each room impossibly tiny. Yet each room you enter is full-sized, some even expansive. The mirrors in the fun house don't reflect properly. You stand in front of a mirror and your reflection is correct, standard, showing exactly what you'd expect, but then you move and your reflection stays where it was, or your reflection moves differently than you moved, or your reflection moves before you move, anticipating your actions by a fraction of a second so that it looks like you're copying it rather than it copying you. The mirrors aren't reflecting. They're showing you alternate versions of yourself existing in slightly different time streams or spatial configurations. Each one real, each one navigating the fun house according to slightly different rules. There's a moment when you exit one corridor, pass through a room, enter another corridor, and realize you can see yourself through a window. Not a mirror, a window showing the corridor you just left. And there you are, still in that corridor, still moving forward, even though you're simultaneously here in this new corridor, watching yourself. You've split, or time has split, or space has folded in such a way that you're in two locations simultaneously, and the window lets you observe this impossibility directly. When you wave at yourself, your other self doesn't wave back. It's too busy navigating the corridor, unaware that it's being watched by its future self that already completed that navigation. Or perhaps that other self is your past and you're the future. Or perhaps both versions are equally present and the concept of past and future has stopped meaning anything in this folded space. The carousel is the park's centerpiece and its most impossible element. From outside, it appears to be a standard carousel, circular platform, horses mounted on poles, canopy decorated with lights. But when you step onto it and it begins rotating, the rotation doesn't follow normal physics. The horses move up and down on their poles, standard carousel motion, but they also move outward. The carousel is expanding as it rotates, growing larger, the horses spacing themselves farther apart, the central column somehow stretching to accommodate the increased diameter. You're standing on a rotating platform, and the platform is getting bigger, yet when you look down at your feet, you're not moving away from the center. The expansion is happening without displacing anything that was already on the carousel. It's not that the horses are moving outward relative to the center. It's that the space between them is increasing while their relationships to each other remain constant. The carousel is somehow adding space to itself, inflating its internal geometry without changing its external dimensions, because when you look at it from off the platform, it still appears to be a standard-sized carousel, maybe 30 feet in diameter. But from on the platform, you can see horses that are 50 feet from the center, 100 feet, expanding outward until the carousel's edge is too distant to see clearly, despite the whole structure supposedly being only 30 feet across. When Sybil attacks Harry on this carousel, or when Sybil, possessed by the parasite, attacks, the battle occurs across an impossible distance. Harry runs from horse to horse, seeking cover, and each horse is mounted in what should be easy sprinting distance from the next, but somehow each sprint takes significant time. He's covering what looks like 10 feet, but what feels like 50 feet, and the carousel continues expanding throughout the battle, the horses receding from each other, the platform growing larger and larger while simultaneously remaining its apparent 30-foot diameter to any external observer. The Otherworld amusement park demonstrates what happens when impossible architecture is allowed to move. Buildings at least pretend to be static. Even when they reconfigure, they do so between your visits, maintaining the illusion that they're solid structures that happen to have fluid layouts. The carousel abandons that pretense. It transforms while you watch, while you're standing on it, expanding and contracting, according to rules that have nothing to do with physics and everything to do with some deeper, stranger logic that governs how Silent Hill's spaces operate. Nowhere represents the culmination of Silent Hill's impossible architecture. The location's name explicitly announces its ontological status. This is a place that isn't a place, a nowhere that somehow has spatial presence, a location that exists outside the normal framework of geography and perhaps outside the normal framework of existence itself. You reach nowhere through the amusement park, descending a staircase that goes down far longer than should be possible. The stairs themselves are normal, concrete steps, metal railings, nothing outwardly strange about them, but they descend forever. Harry counts steps as he descends and loses track after several hundred. The staircase isn't spiraling, isn't switching back on itself. It's a straight descent, which means he should have descended miles below the Earth's surface, past the bedrock, past any depth where a structure could reasonably exist. Yet the temperature doesn't increase the way it should as you descend toward the Earth's core. The air stays cold, gets colder even, suggesting that depth and temperature have decoupled from their normal relationship. At the bottom, nowhere reveals itself as a space that doesn't pretend to follow any rules at all. The other locations in Silent Hill, the school, the hospital, the streets, maintain some semblance of their mundane identities, even in their otherworld forms. They were recognizably distorted versions of comprehensible structures. Nowhere isn't a distorted version of anything. It's pure impossible architecture, space organized according to principles that have nothing to do with how buildings work or how reality works. The first area of nowhere resembles a warehouse or factory floor, all industrial fixtures and conveyor belts, except the conveyors don't go anywhere. They loop back on themselves in ways that should create intersections but don't. A belt emerges from a wall, runs 50 feet, and disappears into another wall, and you can see both walls and confirm they're not parallel, not positioned in any configuration where a straight conveyor belt could connect them. Yet the belt runs between them effortlessly, bending space to accommodate its path rather than bending itself to accommodate space. The walls in nowhere are positioned wrong. They meet at angles that aren't right angles but also aren't any other standard angle. They meet at angles that don't exist in Euclidean geometry, angles that hurt to look at because your brain can't process what it's seeing. Two walls converging at an angle of what appears to be negative degrees, creating a corner that points inward in multiple directions simultaneously. A ceiling that's closer to you than the floor is, even though you're standing upright. Doorways positioned on walls that aren't vertical, yet when you walk through them, you don't have to tilt. Gravity reorients itself to treat the angled wall as down. The corridors branch according to logic you can't follow. You're walking down a straight hallway and side corridors appear, but they don't branch off at standard angles. They don't branch off at any angle. They simply exist perpendicular to your corridor in directions that aren't left or right or up or down. You can see down these perpendicular passages and they look navigable, but when you try to turn into one, you can't. Your body refuses to make the turn because the turn requires rotating in a direction that your three-dimensional body isn't equipped to rotate. You're being shown corridors that exist in additional spatial dimensions you can perceive but not access. There are rooms in nowhere that are larger on the inside than outside. not subtly larger in the way that clever architecture can create spacious feeling interiors within modest exteriors, but explicitly, undeniably larger. You enter through a doorway that's 6 feet wide, step into a room, and the room extends for hundreds of feet in every direction. The walls are solid, you can walk to them and touch them and confirm they're real, but the space they enclose is far greater than the building's external dimensions could accommodate. You're inside a room that's the size of an aircraft hangar, accessible through a doorway in a wall that the exterior view established as being part of a structure maybe 20 feet deep. Worse are the rooms that are smaller on the inside than outside. You approach a door, the wall around it suggests the room beyond should be substantial. You can see where the external walls must be based on the building's shape, giving you a sense of the room's dimensions before you enter. Then you open the door and step into a closet. Not a room that's smaller than you expected, a literal closet, barely large enough to turn around in. The discrepancy is so extreme that you back out and examine the exterior again, confirming that yes, there should be a much larger space behind that door, but there isn't. The building is eating its own interior volume, compressing space in ways that violate conservation of volume the same way certain quantum effects violate conservation of energy. The catwalks in Nowhere's industrial sections create impossible networks. They're suspended over darkness, metal walkways with railings, and they connect to each other in ways that topology doesn't allow. A catwalk branches into two paths. You take the left path, and it curves around and reconnects with the original catwalk ahead of where you branched off. Fine, that's just a loop. But then you take the right path from the branch point, and it also curves around and reconnects with the original catwalk ahead of the branch point, at the exact same location where the left path reconnected. Two different paths, curving in different directions, visible to you as you walk them, arriving at the same destination without ever converging or crossing. They maintain their separation throughout their entire lengths, but terminate at the same point, which should be impossible but isn't, because Nowhere doesn't care what should be impossible. You can walk these catwalks and map them, and the map you create will show structures that can't exist, paths that cross without intersecting, loops that contain their own exteriors, connections that link points which have no valid geometric relationship. If you try to build these catwalk networks in our reality with our physics, they would collapse into contradiction. In Nowhere, they hold together perfectly, carrying traffic across the void below according to rules that are consistent within this space, even though they're impossible within our space. The void below the catwalks deserves its own consideration. It's not darkness, not simply an absence of light that could be illuminated with sufficient lumens. It's darkness of a different kind, ontological darkness, absence that's actively present. Looking down through the catwalk, grading into that void, you're looking at nothing, and the nothing looks back. There's an intelligence to that darkness, or if not intelligence, then at least attention. It's aware of you standing above it. It's waiting for you to fall, not passively, but with anticipation, with something that might be hunger, if hunger could exist in the absence of any organ or entity that could feel hunger. Occasionally something moves in that void. You catch glimpses of motion, shapes that are darker than the surrounding darkness, forms that suggest size without revealing scale. These might be creatures moving through the emptiness below. They might be spatial distortions, places where the void folds in on itself and the fold creates the illusion of something passing through. Or they might be something else entirely, thoughts perhaps, made visible through their movement in this space where thought and reality have merged. There's a section of Nowhere that resembles apartments, domestic spaces stacked in configurations that don't work. You enter an apartment on what you think is the third floor, walk through its rooms, exit through its back door, and you're on the first floor. Not because you descended stairs, there were no stairs in the apartment, but because the apartment existed on two floors simultaneously, or because floors are numbered according to a system that doesn't correspond to physical height. You can enter the same apartment through different doors and find completely different layouts. The living room from the front entrance isn't the same living room you reach when entering from the side entrance. These aren't different apartments with similar layouts. They're the same apartment existing in multiple configurations simultaneously, each one accessible depending on your approach vector. The bathroom in one of these apartments contains a mirror, and when Harry looks into it, he sees himself standing in a different bathroom. The mirror isn't reflecting the room he's in, it's showing him a different instance of a similar room, and he can see details in the mirror bathroom that don't match the bathroom he's standing in. Different tile colors, different fixtures, but the Harry in the mirror matches his movements exactly, suggesting it's really him, really a reflection, just a reflection of him standing in a bathroom that isn't the one he's currently occupying. When he reaches toward the mirror to touch it, his reflection does something different. It stops reaching. It lowers its hand. It looks at Harry with an expression of warning or sorrow. Then it turns and walks out of the mirror's frame, leaving Harry staring at his reflection of an empty bathroom that isn't the bathroom he's in. For a moment, Harry can see his mirror self through the mirror bathroom's doorway, walking down a corridor. Then, the mirror reverts to normal reflection behavior, showing Harry what he expects to see, himself in the bathroom he's actually standing in. This moment encapsulates the horror of nowhere. You can't trust anything, not even fundamental principles, like mirrors reflect their surroundings or walking through a door leads somewhere predictable. The rules change without warning. Space folds in ways that look stable until you test them and discover they're not stable at all. You're navigating through a reality that's fluid, negotiable, willing to maintain the appearance of consistency until suddenly it isn't, at which point you're confronted with the fact that nothing here is what it appears to be, and anything could change at any moment. The mannequin rooms in Nowhere are particularly disturbing. These are spaces filled with department store mannequins arranged in tableau. Domestic scenes, workplace scenes, social gatherings. The mannequins are positioned as if they're people engaged in normal activities, except mannequins don't have faces detailed enough to convey expression, don't have joints flexible enough to achieve natural poses. Yet here they are, arranged in ways that suggest conversation, interaction, relationship. The first time you pass through one of these rooms, the mannequins are static, standard, inanimate objects, but something about them feels off. You're certain they're watching you despite their blank faces, certain they're aware despite being plastic and foam. You navigate through them, exit the room, continue through Nowhere's corridors. Later you return to the same room through a different entrance, and the mannequins have moved. They're in different positions. The tableau have reconfigured. What was a dinner scene is now an office scene. The mannequins are different mannequins, or perhaps they're the same mannequins in different poses, but either way, they've changed. Some players have reported that if you stay in the mannequin rooms long enough, standing perfectly still, you can see the mannequins move, not all at once, and not obviously, but if you focus your attention on one mannequin while keeping another in your peripheral vision, you'll catch the peripheral one shifting slightly. Turn to look at it directly and it's frozen again. Return your focus to the first mannequin, and again, peripherally, you catch the second one moving. They're only mobile when unobserved. or only appear mobile when you're not looking directly, and the ambiguity of whether they're actually moving or whether your mind is playing tricks on you is more unsettling than if they were overtly animate. There's a room near Nowhere's conclusion where Harry finds a chair facing a wall. Just a chair, wooden, ordinary, positioned a few feet from a blank wall. Nothing else in the room. The game gives you the option to sit in the chair. If you do, the camera angle shifts to Harry's perspective. You're looking at the wall from the chair, seeing exactly what Harry would see, and the wall isn't blank anymore. From this specific angle, from this specific chair, the wall reveals images, not projected. There's no light source that could project them, not painted. When you examine the wall from any other angle, it's featureless. But from the chair, sitting in exactly the position Harry's sitting in, the wall shows you things, scenes from Silent Hill's history, glimpses of events that haven't happened yet or might not happen at all, the face of someone you haven't met, a location you haven't visited. The images shift and flow like watching a screen, except there's no screen, just a wall that from this precise observation point becomes a window into other times and places. Stand up, look at the wall, and it's blank again. Sit back down, and the images return. The implication is that nowhere contains observation dependent realities, spaces where what exists is determined by where you're standing, how you're looking, what angle you're observing from. The wall both contains those images and doesn't contain them, and both states are true, with observation determining which truth manifests. This connects to larger implications about Silent Hill's otherworld that Nowhere makes explicit. Throughout the series, there's been ambiguity about whether the otherworld is a shared, objective reality that multiple people experience simultaneously, or whether each person experiences their own subjective otherworld tailored to their specific guilt and trauma. Nowhere suggests the answer is both. It's a space where subjective and objective have merged, where individual experience and shared reality exist in superposition, where your personal nightmare and someone else's personal nightmare can occupy the same coordinates without ever quite interacting. When Harry encounters Dahlia in Nowhere's depths, she's standing in a room that from Harry's perspective is a nightmare of industrial decay, rust, blood, machinery designed to hurt rather than help. But Dahlia doesn't react to these elements. She speaks to Harry as if they're standing in a normal room, suggesting that from her perspective, they are. She's occupying the same coordinates Harry is occupying, but she's experiencing a different version of that space, one that aligns with her consciousness rather than his. They're having a conversation while standing in two different rooms that happen to spatially coincide. This explains the previously confusing encounters where multiple characters are present in the other world but don't seem to be experiencing the same environment. James and Angela in Silent Hill 2, encountering each other on a staircase where James sees normal decay but Angela sees flames. Murphy and Anne in Silent Hill, Downpour, crossing paths and spaces where each sees different monsters, different obstacles. They're all navigating the same coordinates but experiencing reality overlays unique to their individual consciousness. And nowhere is where this phenomenon becomes undeniable and explicit. The ritual chamber at Nowhere's deepest point represents the location's final revelation about impossible space. It's a room that shouldn't exist. You've descended too far for any room to exist here, miles below the Earth's surface, yet the room has breathable air, manageable temperature, and gravity that works in the expected direction. The chamber is circular, which is the only normal thing about it. The walls curve around you, and inscribed on those walls are symbols that shift as you look at them, rearranging themselves into different configurations. the same marks appearing in different patterns depending on observation angle and duration. The floor of the chamber contains the ritual circle that Dahlia has been working toward throughout the game. It's geometric, triangles, lines, curves, but the geometry is wrong in ways that echo the wrongness throughout nowhere. Lines that should be straight have curvature you can detect, but not measure. Angles that should be acute or obtuse are somehow neither and both. The circle itself isn't a perfect circle. It's slightly elliptical, or perhaps it's a perfect circle viewed from an angle, except you're looking directly down at it, and circles viewed from directly above should appear perfectly circular. When the ritual activates and Alessa's split soul reunites, the chamber responds. The walls begin reconfiguring. The ceiling lowers and raises simultaneously. The floor tilts without tilting. You remain standing upright, but your inner ear insists you're at an angle. Space within the chamber becomes plastic, moldable, shifting according to the ritual's requirements rather than according to physical law. The chamber was built or manifested to facilitate this ritual, and facilitating it requires flexibility in how space operates. The God that emerges from Alessa exists partially outside normal space. You can see parts of it clearly: flesh, wings, forms that are almost comprehensible, but other parts of it don't resolve properly. Your eyes slide off certain sections, unable to focus, unable to process what they're seeing. Not because it's too bright or too dark, but because it's occupying spatial dimensions your perception isn't equipped to handle. The God exists partially in our three dimensions and partially in additional dimensions, and the portions that extend into those additional dimensions are visible as distortions, as areas where the image seems to fold or tear or refuse to cohere. Fighting this entity becomes an exercise in navigating impossible geometry. The arena, the ritual chamber, reconfigures constantly during the battle. What was solid floor becomes void. What was void becomes solid. The walls rotate, bringing new sections into accessibility while removing sections you were just standing on. You're fighting a boss while simultaneously navigating a space that's actively hostile, that's reforming itself according to rules you can't predict, and the combination creates a battle where positioning matters more than damage output, because being in the wrong location when the space reconfigures means falling into the void or being crushed by converging walls. The defeat of this God entity triggers a collapse. Not just the ritual chamber, but all of nowhere begins breaking down. The impossible architecture can't sustain itself without the ritual energies that were holding it together. Walls crack, floors fragment, the cat walks over the void, shake and buckle. Harry has to navigate back through spaces that are disintegrating, that are reverting from their structured impossibility back into formless void. Corridors seal themselves as he passes through. Rooms disappear entirely. The apartment sections collapse into a single undifferentiated mass of domestic debris. Furniture and fixtures compressed together without regard for what goes where. This collapse reveals something crucial about Nowhere and Silent Hill's impossible architecture generally. It requires constant maintenance. The spaces that violate physics don't sustain themselves effortlessly. They're held in their impossible configurations by force, by will, by energy expenditure from whatever mechanism or entity created them. When that force withdraws, when the energy stops flowing, the impossible architecture collapses back toward baseline reality. It doesn't collapse completely. Silent Hill's curse ensures that some wrongness persists, but the extreme violations, the most explicit impossibilities, those require active maintenance. Harry escapes Nowhere as it's collapsing, ascending the impossible staircase that's now even more explicitly impossible because sections of it are missing. He has to jump gaps where stairs used to be. He has to climb portions where the stairs have rotated vertical. The staircase is breaking down into components that no longer connect properly, becoming a disjointed collection of segments hanging in void, and Harry navigates from segment to segment, hoping that enough of the structure persists long enough for him to reach the top. When he emerges, holding the infant that Alessa manifested as her final act, he's back in normal Silent Hill, the fog world, not the other world. The town appears almost mundane after the extremes of nowhere, street corners that meet at normal angles, buildings with conventional interiors, distances that remain consistent when you traverse them. The baseline wrongness of Silent Hill is still present, but compared to Nowhere's aggressive impossibility, it feels almost comfortable. This contrast is intentional. Team Silent understood that after pushing impossible architecture to its absolute extreme in Nowhere, returning to baseline Silent Hill would create a sense of relief that makes the player complicit in accepting the town's wrongness as normal. When street corners meeting at 90 degrees feels comforting, when a building having a comprehensible interior feels like sanctuary, you've been conditioned to accept violations of normalcy as long as they're not extreme violations. Silent Hill has recalibrated your sense of what's acceptable in architecture and geography, and that recalibration is itself a form of horror. You've been changed by your time in impossible spaces, made more tolerant of wrongness, and you can never fully return to taking normal geometry for granted. Silent Hill 2 approaches impossible architecture from a different angle than the first game, where Harry's journey took him through spaces that were explicitly supernatural, manifested by a cult's ritual, shaped by a god's impending birth. James Sunderland's journey takes him through spaces that are supposedly psychological. The town is responding to his guilt, his trauma, his repressed memories. The impossible places he encounters are theoretically projections of his internal state rather than objective supernatural locations. But this explanation doesn't actually make the spaces less impossible. If anything, it makes them more disturbing. A space that exists because a god willed it into being at least has the comfort of external causation. Something outside you created this wrongness. A space that exists because your mind willed it into being means you're the source of the impossibility. The horror is internal. You're creating spaces that violate physics through the sheer force of your psychological damage. The apartments James explores early in his journey establish this internal impossibility. These are ordinary residential spaces, small rooms, basic furniture, the infrastructure of working class life. But they're wrong in ways that ordinary wrongness can't explain. The walls are the right distance apart, but they feel closer than they are. The ceilings are normal height, but they press down with weight that has nothing to do with structural load. These spaces are oppressive not because of their physical dimensions, but because of something else, something related to the consciousness experiencing them. James enters an apartment on one floor, walks through its rooms, exits through a different door, and finds himself on a completely different floor. Not because he climbed stairs, there were no stairs in the apartment, but because the space folded between entrance and exit. The apartment served as a transitional zone, a place where the normal rules of upstairs is above downstairs stopped applying. You enter on the third floor, you exit on the fifth floor, and the apartment you traversed was somehow between them despite occupying third floor coordinates from the outside. The Blue Creek apartments demonstrate this phenomenon extensively. The building appears to be a standard 5-story structure from the exterior. Inside, you can access 8 floors, not sub-basements that would explain the additional levels. 8 distinct above-ground floors in a building whose exterior only has space for 5. The floors stack impossibly, occupying the same vertical space through some mechanism that has nothing to do with how buildings work. Room 208 in Blue Creek contains a clock that's stopped at a specific time. Every time James enters this room, and the game forces him to enter it multiple times through various routes, the clock shows the same stop time, except the room changes. The furniture is in different positions. The bloodstains are in different locations. The body slumped in the corner is in a different state of decay. The room is being reset to different versions of itself while maintaining certain consistent elements, suggesting that it exists in multiple states simultaneously, with observation determining which state manifests. The bathroom in one of the apartments is larger than the apartment's entire floor plan should allow. James enters a one-bedroom apartment, maybe 600 square feet total. The bathroom within this apartment is easily 200 square feet, normal for a bathroom. But when you map out the apartment's other rooms, bedroom, living room, kitchen, they account for more than 400 square feet. The spaces within the apartment add up to more than the apartment's total area. The bathroom isn't just occupying available space, it's occupying space that doesn't exist within the apartment's boundaries, yet it's definitely inside the apartment because you access it through an interior door. This impossible internal volume is cosmic horror at a domestic scale. Your apartment, one of the most familiar, controlled spaces in human experience, is bigger on the inside than on the outside. The place where you should feel most safe, most able to understand and navigate, is violating the fundamental principles that make navigation possible. If you can't trust your apartment to maintain consistent geometry, what can you trust? Brookhaven Hospital in Silent Hill 2 takes the medical facility horror of the first game's Alchemilla and intensifies it by making the impossibility more intimate. Where Alchemilla's corridors stretched into impossible distances, Brookhaven's corridors loop back on themselves in ways that create unsolvable topology. You walk down a straight hallway, take the first right, walk straight, take another right, walk straight, take another right, walk straight, and you should return to where you started. That's how rectangular loops work. But you don't return to where you started. You're somewhere completely different, somewhere that, according to the turns you took, couldn't possibly connect to your origin point. The patient rooms in Brookhaven are too numerous. The building has a certain number of exterior windows, and each patient room should have at least one window, which means the number of patient rooms should be roughly equal to or less than the number of windows. But James finds far more patient rooms than there are windows. Some of the rooms he enters have windows showing exterior views. Some have windows showing interior views, looking into other rooms within the hospital, or into corridors, or into spaces that don't seem to be part of the hospital at all. And some patient rooms, despite being on exterior walls where windows should be mandatory by building codes, have no windows at all, just solid walls where daylight should enter. The basement of Brookhaven contains the kitchen and laundry facilities you'd expect in a hospital's service level. It also contains a prison, not a secured psychiatric ward, which might make sense in a hospital context, but an actual prison. Cells with bars, shackles on walls, isolation chambers. The prison section is extensive, implying a large footprint, but the hospital's basement isn't large enough to contain it. The hospital above and the prison below don't have matching floor plans. The prison extends beyond the hospital's foundation in multiple directions, occupying ground that the exterior view establishes as being part of the hospital's lawn or parking lot. When James descends into this prison section, he's entering a space that exists in violation of the building's external dimensions. And unlike Alchemilla's sub-basements, which at least maintain the pretense of being unusually deep service areas, Brookhaven's prison doesn't pretend to belong. It's explicitly wrong, obviously impossible, and the game makes no attempt to rationalize it. James walks from hospital to prison through an ordinary door, and the fact that a prison couldn't fit in that location doesn't prevent it from being there. The prison cells themselves demonstrate impossible interiority. James looks into a cell through the barred door. He can see the entire cell, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, containing a bed and a toilet and nothing else. He unlocks the door, enters the cell, and it's larger than it appeared from outside. Not dramatically larger, not warehouse sized, but definitely bigger than the 8 by 10 space he observed before entering. The walls are farther apart, the ceiling is higher. The cell from inside contains space that didn't exist when viewed from outside, space that manifested upon entry, suggesting that observation and presence affect the cell's geometry. Some cells contain corpses in advanced decay. Some cells contain corpses in early decay. Some cells contain fresh corpses. James is seeing the same cells, same numbers, same locations, but at different points in their timeline. Or he's seeing different timelines simultaneously. The cell that contains a skeleton from one approach contains a recently deceased body from another approach. The space isn't just geometrically impossible, it's temporally impossible, existing in multiple time states at once. The spiral staircase James descends to reach the historical society demonstrates impossible depth through elegance rather than industrial grimness. It's beautiful, this staircase. Ornate railings, carefully maintained steps, soft lighting from sconces along the walls, and it descends forever. The stairs spiral down through what should be 1 or 2 sub-basement levels, but they continue far beyond that. James descends for minutes, passing level after level, descending hundreds of feet below the surface, and the staircase shows no signs of ending. The sconces continue providing light, the railings continue their ornate design. Everything about the staircase suggests it's a maintained, intentional structure rather than an abandoned void space. When James finally reaches the bottom and enters the historical society, he's at a depth that shouldn't be accessible. The air pressure should be noticeably different. The temperature should be higher. There should be water seepage from the lake that's nearby and at a much higher elevation. None of these things are present. The historical society exists in perfectly comfortable environmental conditions despite being impossibly deep, suggesting that it's not actually deep in the conventional sense. It's displaced, existing in a space that's adjacent to the normal world rather than beneath it, and the staircase served as a transitional zone between normal space and wherever the historical society actually is. The historical society's rooms contain paintings that change, not obviously, not in ways you can catch if you stare at them, but between visits. James sees a painting of an executioner wearing a pyramid-shaped hood during his first pass through the gallery. When he returns to that gallery later, the executioner in the painting has moved. Different posture, different position within the frame. The painting has progressed, showing a later moment in whatever scene it depicts, or it's showing an alternate version of the scene, or observation has changed what the painting contains. This ties to a principle that becomes increasingly explicit as Silent Hill 2 progresses. Spaces in this version of the town are observer dependent. They exist in a state of quantum superposition until observed, at which point they collapse into a specific configuration determined by the observer's consciousness. James sees rooms organized around his guilt about Mary's death. Angela sees rooms organized around her trauma from abuse. Eddie sees rooms organized around his rage and victimhood. They can occupy the same physical location while experiencing completely different environments because the location exists in multiple states simultaneously, selecting which state to present based on who's looking. The encounter between James and Angela on the burning staircase makes this explicit. James enters a stairwell, and it's normal: concrete stairs, metal railings, ordinary service architecture. Angela is already in the stairwell, and from her perspective, it's on fire. The walls are burning. The stairs are burning. The heat is intense enough that she's sweating and struggling to breathe. James doesn't see the flames. He doesn't feel the heat. For him, the stairwell is neutral, comfortable. For her, it's hell. Both experiences are equally real. The stairwell is simultaneously burning and not burning, existing in superposition, presenting different states to different observers. This shouldn't be possible. Fire is an objective phenomenon that should affect all observers equally. But in Silent Hill's impossible spaces, objectivity has broken down. The space adapts to consciousness, reflecting internal states externally, and when multiple consciousnesses occupy the same space, the space somehow accommodates all of them by existing multiply. This has profound implications for understanding what Silent Hill's impossible architecture actually is. It's not simply that buildings are bigger on the inside than the outside, or that corridors stretch longer than they should. It's that space itself has become subjective, negotiable, responsive to consciousness in ways that our universe's space isn't. The town is operating according to rules that allow mind and matter to interact directly, where thought can reshape geometry, where guilt can create corridors, and trauma can generate rooms. Toluca Prison represents James's psychological need for punishment, manifesting as architectural impossibility. The prison shouldn't be accessible from Silent Hill's geography. There's no prison marked on any map of the town, no historical records of a detention facility in this location. Yet James finds it anyway, enters it, navigates through it, suggesting that the prison exists specifically because he's there, called into being by his conviction that he deserves imprisonment. The prison's layout is labyrinthine in ways that actual prisons aren't. Real prisons are designed for efficient monitoring: straight corridors with good sight lines, centralized guard stations that allow observation of multiple cell blocks. Toluca Prison is designed to confuse. Its corridors branch and intersect in patterns that don't serve any security purpose. Cell blocks connect to other cell blocks through paths that would allow prisoners to move between areas unsupervised. The whole facility is organized according to nightmare logic rather than carceral logic. The gallows puzzle in the prison's courtyard makes James judge prisoners based on their crimes, determining who deserves execution. The puzzle is psychological torture disguised as a mechanical challenge. James has to read descriptions of what these prisoners did, evaluate their guilt, and literally pull the lever that will execute the one he selects. He's being forced to act as judge and executioner while himself being guilty of murder. And the prison's architecture facilitates this by creating a courtyard with functional gallows that shouldn't exist in this location at this time. When James descends from the prison into the labyrinth, he's entering a space that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is: an impossible structure designed purely to test, to trap, to force navigation through hostile geometry. The labyrinth acknowledges through its name and structure that it's not trying to masquerade as a normal location. It's openly, explicitly impossible, and that honesty makes it more horrifying than locations that maintain some pretense of normalcy. The labyrinth's corridors are metal gratings suspended over void. You can see down through the floor into darkness that extends infinitely. You can see up through the ceiling into more darkness, extending infinitely in the other direction. The labyrinth isn't built on ground or under ceiling. It's suspended in nothing, a structure floating in empty space, and the void above and below suggests that it exists in a place where concepts like ground and sky don't apply. Navigation requires finding your way through this suspended network of corridors and rooms, but the labyrinth reconfigures itself as you move through it. A corridor you traverse north will run south when you return to it. A door that led to one room will lead to a different room on your next passage. The labyrinth isn't static, it's actively reshaping itself to increase difficulty, to extend the challenge, to ensure that navigation remains perpetually uncertain. At the labyrinth's center is a cube, a massive rotating cube that serves as both puzzle and metaphor. The cube's faces show different symbols, and rotating the cube to display specific symbols opens doors to different areas. But the cube is also doing something more interesting architecturally. When you enter the cube and climb its internal stairs, you're climbing in one direction. When you exit the cube into a new area, you emerge in a location that suggests you climbed in a different direction. The cube is reorienting space within itself, making up and down negotiable concepts rather than fixed directions. The cube sits at the intersection of multiple impossibilities. It's at the center of the labyrinth that's floating in void. It contains staircases that lead to locations that aren't in the direction the staircases climb, and it responds to James's manipulations by opening doors to areas that couldn't possibly connect to the cube's physical location. The cube is a nexus, a point where multiple impossible geometries converge, and navigating through it means briefly existing in a space where every direction leads somewhere other than where it should. The final descent into the otherworld version of the labyrinth reveals that everything James has been navigating through was the sanitized version. The otherworld labyrinth strips away any remaining pretense. The corridors aren't metal grating anymore, they're organic, pulsing, alive. The walls aren't walls, they're membranes. The structure isn't a structure, it's a body, and James is navigating through the interior of something vast and aware that's allowing him passage toward its heart where Mary waits. This recontextualizes all of Silent Hill 2's impossible architecture. It wasn't random spatial distortions or psychologically manifested geography. It was all part of this entity, this place that's also a being, this town that's conscious and responsive and actively guiding James through a carefully designed journey toward confrontation with his guilt. The impossible spaces were impossible because they were never intended to be buildings or prisons or hospitals in any conventional sense. They were components of a vast organism that wears building shapes the way a hunter wears camouflage. Silent Hill 3 continues the exploration of impossible architecture through Heather's journey, but with a crucial difference. Heather is aware that the spaces are wrong. Harry spent much of the first game confused by the impossibilities, trying to rationalize them. James was too consumed by guilt to question them. Heather recognizes the wrongness immediately and responds with anger rather than fear, which changes how the impossible architecture manifests around her. The shopping mall where Heather's journey begins demonstrates impossibility through familiarity perverted. Malls are spaces we understand implicitly, anchor stores at the ends, smaller shops arranged along corridors, food courts somewhere central. We navigate malls almost unconsciously, following design patterns that repeat across thousands of locations. Silent Hill's Central Square shopping center follows those patterns, which makes the violations more disturbing because you know what should be there and can recognize when it isn't. The corridors are too long. Walking from one end of the mall to the other takes far longer than the building's external dimensions allow. The shops are too numerous. You count storefronts as you pass, and there are dozens more than could fit in a structure this size. And when you look at the mall directory, the directory lists stores on floors that don't exist. The directory shows 5 levels. The elevator serves 3. Both can't be true, but both are true, existing in contradiction without resolution. The otherworld transformation of the mall is where impossibility becomes aggressive. The shopping. Corridors become intestinal passages, all organic and pulsing, suggesting that the mall was always meant to digest rather than serve customers. The shops become chambers within a vast body, each one serving some biological function that has nothing to do with retail. The food court becomes something that's actually about food, not serving it, but processing it, digesting it, extracting nutrients through mechanisms that are horrifyingly organic. The escalators in the Otherworld Mall don't connect properly to the floors they serve. An escalator rises from the first floor, and you can see it terminating at the second floor, but when you ride it to the top, you're on the third floor. The escalator has transported you farther than its visible length accounts for, suggesting that riding it involves passing through space that exists between floors, space that's not accessible anyway, except by being on the escalator as it moves. The amusement park that Heather navigates later in her journey contains a carousel that echoes the first game's carousel, but pushes the impossibility farther. This carousel doesn't just expand as it rotates, it transforms. The horses become different creatures. The platform changes shape from circular to elliptical to polygonal and back to circular. The carousel is shifting through different configurations, each one stable while it manifests but none permanent, and riding it means existing in a space that's fundamentally fluid, fundamentally uncertain. The haunted house attraction in the amusement park is designed to be disorienting. That's the point of haunted houses, controlled disorientation within a safe environment. But the Silent Hill version abandons the safe part while maintaining and intensifying the disorientation. The haunted house is far larger than its exterior. You enter through a standard attraction entrance and find yourself in a building that contains dozens of rooms spreading over what feels like thousands of square feet, all somehow fitting into a structure that from outside appeared to be maybe 100 feet on each side. The rooms in the haunted house contain scenes, mannequins arranged in tableaux meant to frighten or disturb, but the scenes change between visits. You pass through a room showing a bedroom scene, continue deeper into the haunted house, loop back, pass through the same doorway, and the room now shows a kitchen scene. Different mannequins, different furniture, different everything, yet undeniably the same room accessed through the same doorway from the same corridor. The chapel that Heather enters late in her journey demonstrates impossible, sacred architecture. Churches and cathedrals are spaces designed around specific symbolic geometries, the cross shape of the floor plan, the vertical emphasis drawing eyes and thoughts toward heaven, the calculated use of light and shadow to create atmosphere. Silent Hill's chapel follows these principles while simultaneously violating them. The nave is too long. Walking from the entrance to the altar takes minutes of continuous forward movement, yet the building's exterior showed a modest church, the kind where the distance from door to altar should be measurable in seconds. The length has expanded internally, while the external dimensions remained constant. The church is consuming space from somewhere else to accommodate its impossible nave. The ceiling height fluctuates. When you first enter, the ceiling soars upward in proper cathedral fashion, emphasizing vertical space. But as you approach the altar, the ceiling lowers. By the time you reach the front of the nave, the ceiling is oppressively close, creating claustrophobic pressure that contradicts the openness you experienced at the entrance. The church is demonstrating that its geometry isn't fixed, that it can reconfigure itself to create specific emotional effects, lengthening or shortening or raising or lowering according to symbolic rather than structural logic. The confessionals along the side aisles are portals rather than booths. You enter a confessional from the nave, expecting to find a small enclosed space for private confession. Instead, you find yourself in a corridor that extends far beyond where the confessional booth should terminate. The booth is bigger on the inside, vastly bigger, containing spaces that couldn't fit within its visible dimensions. The confessional has become a passageway to another area entirely, suggesting that certain structures within the church serve as thresholds, as doors to locations that aren't spatially adjacent but are conceptually connected. The room of crying footsteps demonstrates manifestation through observation. Heather enters a corridor and hears footsteps, sees bloody footprints appearing in real time, tracking toward a wall. When the footsteps stop, a painting on the wall begins bleeding. When Heather examines the painting, it moves aside, revealing a door that wasn't there moments before. The door manifested because she observed the phenomenon that required its existence. The footsteps needed somewhere to lead. An observation of that need caused the door to come into being. This suggests that Silent Hill's spaces are partially incomplete, existing in potential until observation forces them into actuality. The door wasn't there until Heather needed it to be there to resolve the paradox of footsteps leading nowhere. Her consciousness, her observation, her logical requirement that footsteps must lead somewhere caused the space to generate an appropriate destination. Valtiel appears throughout this section of the church, visible in places he shouldn't be able to reach, behind walls of solid metal, in crawl spaces too small for a body, on ceilings where gravity should prevent standing. He's moving through the church according to rules that aren't human rules, accessing spaces through methods that aren't doors and corridors. His presence suggests that the impossible architecture of Silent Hill's sacred spaces exists specifically to accommodate entities like him, beings that don't navigate through three-dimensional space in the ways humans navigate, and the corridors and rooms humans can access are just a subset of a much more extensive network of passages and chambers that exist in dimensions humans can't perceive. The final descent through the church takes Heather down spiral stairs that pass through layers of transformation. The stairs begin in the normal church aesthetic: stone and wood, religious iconography, familiar materials. As she descends, the aesthetic shifts, becomes more industrial, more organic, more alien. The transition is gradual enough that she doesn't notice a clear boundary between church and not church. The stairs simply carry her through a continuous transformation where the space slowly stops being sacred architecture and becomes something else, something that doesn't have a name in human building categories. At the bottom lies the birth chamber where Claudia attempts to manifest God. The chamber is circular, appropriate for ritual purposes, but its proportions are wrong in ways that create deep unease. The circle isn't quite a perfect circle. It's warped, distorted, as if curved space is affecting its shape. The walls slope inward at angles that should make the chamber feel smaller as you move toward its center, but the center feels farther away the closer you get to it, suggesting that distance within the chamber doesn't scale linearly. The God that emerges is partially outside three-dimensional space. Portions of it extend into additional dimensions that are visible as distortions or absences in the areas where normal space can't accommodate its geometry. Fighting this entity means battling something that's partially not there, partially existing in spaces your attacks can't reach because those spaces aren't accessible to three-dimensional objects like bullets or weapons. When Heather defeats the god, the chamber collapses, but the collapse reveals what was always underneath. The chamber was never built on ground. It was suspended in void, held in place by the ritual energies, and when those energies dissipate, the chamber begins falling through empty space. Heather escapes up the spiral stairs that are themselves collapsing, climbing through disintegrating architecture while beneath her the chamber plummets into darkness that has no bottom. Silent Hill 4. The room introduces impossibility at the most intimate scale possible, the apartment. Room 302 of South Ashfield Heights is where Henry Townsend finds himself trapped, unable to open the front door, unable to break the windows, unable to contact the outside world despite seeing it through the glass. He's imprisoned in his own apartment, and the apartment is doing things apartments shouldn't do. The first impossible element is the scale. Henry's apartment is a small studio, one main room serving as bedroom and living area, a tiny kitchenette, a bathroom barely large enough for its fixtures. From inside, you can see all the walls, can gauge the apartment's dimensions, and they match what you'd expect from a modest urban studio. But when Henry looks out the window at the building across the street, he can see his own building, and counting windows places his apartment in a location that doesn't match where he experiences it from inside. According to the exterior view, his apartment should have neighbors on both sides. From inside, there's only one adjoining wall that should connect to another apartment, and solid exterior walls on the other three sides. The apartment is spatially inconsistent with its own building. It occupies a location that doesn't match where it appears to exist when viewed externally. This is cosmic horror at the most claustrophobic scale. You're trapped inside a space that doesn't occupy the same coordinates it appears to occupy from outside, and the discrepancy means that even if someone came looking for you, they might not be able to reach you because you're not where you seem to be. Then the holes appear. First in the bathroom, a hole in the wall that wasn't there before, circular, large enough to crawl through, leading to darkness. Henry approaches it cautiously, can feel air moving through it, air that's cold and smells wrong. The hole is a threshold to somewhere else, and eventually he has no choice but to enter it. The holes lead to impossible places. Crawl through the bathroom wall and you emerge in the subway station where the first victim died. Not a recreation of the subway station, the actual location, or something close enough to actual that the distinction stops mattering. The apartment has developed portal connections to locations miles away, locations that shouldn't be accessible through a bathroom wall. The apartment is serving as a nexus, a point where distant spaces converge, and the holes are making those convergences physically navigable. But the portal function isn't the impossible part, or at least not the most impossible part. The most impossible part is what happens to the apartment itself. Each time Henry uses a hole to exit the apartment and travel to one of these distant locations, when he returns, the apartment has changed. Small changes initially, objects moved, furniture rearranged, then larger changes, entire sections redecorated, layouts modified, spaces expanded or contracted. The apartment is evolving or deteriorating or transforming according to a logic Henry can't discern. It's becoming haunted by the victims of Walter Sullivan's ritual murders. Ghosts appear, phantoms of the dead, but they're not just haunting, they're integrating. The victims are being absorbed into the apartment's fabric, their deaths becoming permanent features of room 302's impossible geography. Eileen's apartment, which is directly below Henry's and should have the same dimensions, is larger than Henry's, not subtly, larger, dramatically larger, with additional rooms that couldn't fit in the building's floor plan. Henry can count the windows from outside and determine the maximum size Eileen's apartment could be. But when he's inside it, the apartment extends far beyond those limits. Two apartments in the same building, supposedly identical units, occupying completely different amounts of internal volume while maintaining the same external dimensions. The portal destinations themselves demonstrate varying degrees of impossibility. Some are relatively normal. The subway station, while disconnected from room 302 in any rational geography, is at least a comprehensible space that follows standard architectural rules. Others are far stranger. The water prison is a structure that couldn't exist in any real geography. It's a series of chambers and corridors flooded to various depths, suspended in space with no connection to ground or support structures. The prison floats, impossible, accessible only through Henry's apartment, existing in a void space where it defies gravity and structural requirements while maintaining internal consistency. The water throughout the prison is standing water, not flowing, not connected to any source or drain, just present, filling spaces to precise levels that don't change despite having no mechanism to maintain them. The cells in the water prison demonstrate the same impossible interiority as other locations, rooms that are larger inside than their external dimensions allow, corridors that extend farther than their endpoints suggest. But the water prison adds another layer, depth. The prison has levels that descend below the water, submerged sections accessible through underwater passages. These submerged levels should be completely dark. Sunlight doesn't penetrate deep water, and there are no visible light sources, but they're adequately lit by luminescence that has no identifiable origin. The water itself might be glowing, or the walls might be phosphorescent, or light might be entering from somewhere that isn't visible. The prison's lower levels contain the torture chambers where Walter Sullivan conducted some of his ritual murders. These chambers exist at impossible depths. If the water prison were actually submerged in Toluca Lake, the pressure at these depths would be crushing. But there's no sense of pressure, no difficulty breathing or moving. The space has water's presence without water's physical properties, existing in a state that's partially liquid and partially not, and the ambiguity means that drowning and breathing are both possible depending on variables Henry can't control. The hotel world demonstrates impossibility through scale. From the entrance, the hotel appears modest, a small resort building, maybe 20 rooms total. Inside, the hotel contains hundreds of rooms spreading across dozens of floors. The corridors extend into impossible distances. The elevator serves floors that the building's external height couldn't accommodate. The hotel is consuming space from elsewhere to inflate its interior, becoming a trap where navigation is nearly impossible because the space keeps expanding, rooms multiplying, corridors extending, creating an environment where you can wander forever without reaching anywhere meaningful. The rooms within the hotel are variations on a theme, each one a slightly different take on the standard hotel room concept. But the variations reveal something disturbing. These aren't designed for guests, they're designed for victims. Each room contains evidence of violence, of imprisonment, of suffering. The hotel was never meant to serve travelers. It was always meant to be a factory for trauma, rooms designed specifically to facilitate Walter Sullivan's ritual requirements, and the impossible scale exists to accommodate the number of victims the ritual demanded. One room in the hotel contains a window that looks out onto the hotel's exterior, and through that window you can see yourself in another window looking out. You're observing yourself from a different room, which should be impossible. You can't be in two rooms simultaneously, but there you are, visible in that other window, looking out just as you're looking out. The hotel contains duplicated instances of yourself, or duplicated instances of the moment, or the hotel exists in multiple times streams simultaneously, and you're observing yourself in an alternate stream. The apartment world, the final destination accessible through room 302, is where the impossibility becomes recursive. Henry crawls through a hole and emerges in an apartment building that's identical to his own building. Same layout, same decorations, same everything. He navigates to room 302 in this duplicate building and finds his own apartment, but wrong. The furniture is decayed, the walls are corrupted, the space is haunted by intense malevolence. He's standing in a version of his own apartment that exists in a state of advanced deterioration, and the apartment still contains holes in its walls. He can crawl through one of these holes and emerge in another version of the building, another iteration of room 302, each one progressively more degraded. The apartment is nesting inside itself, each version containing portals to other versions, creating an infinite regression of deteriorating apartments, each one a layer deeper into the curse that Walter Sullivan embedded in room 302's architecture. The deepest version, the most corrupted, is where Walter's original ritual took place. The storage room in the back of the apartment contains ritual implements, blood stains that never dried, symbols carved into walls and floor. This room is the source of all the impossible architecture Henry has been navigating. Walter's ritual created a hole in reality centered on room 302, and that hole has been expanding outward, consuming space, creating connections to distant locations, manifesting impossible geometries. The ritual chamber demonstrates that Walter understood something about space that normal humans don't understand, that consciousness can shape geometry, that belief can create architecture, that obsession can generate rooms and corridors out of nothing but need. Walter needed these spaces to exist for his ritual, and his need was so intense that reality accommodated it. The apartment became what he required it to become, developing portals to the locations where his victims died, absorbing those deaths into its fabric, transforming from a studio apartment into a nexus of impossible spaces all connected through holes that shouldn't exist. Fighting Walter in the final confrontation means battling him across multiple instances of room 302 simultaneously. He appears in one version, you damage him, he disappears and reappears in another version. He's using the apartment's impossible architecture as a weapon, its recursive nesting as defense, forcing Henry to navigate between versions while maintaining combat effectiveness. The apartment itself is an ally to Walter, reconfiguring to support him, creating obstacles for Henry, manifesting hazards that appear and disappear according to what advantages Walter needs. The only way to defeat Walter is to destroy the ritual components in the storage room, the umbilical cord he preserved from his own birth, which serves as the anchor for all the impossible architecture. When Henry destroys the cord, the spaces begin collapsing. The portal holes seal themselves, the distant locations disconnect, the nested apartments collapse into a single instance. Room 302 stops being a nexus and reverts to being an ordinary studio apartment, and that reversion is jarring because Henry has become accustomed to the impossibility. The return to normal geometry feels wrong after so long navigating spaces that violated geometric principles, but the apartment never fully recovers. Even after Walter's defeat, room 302 retains hints of wrongness. The walls are too close sometimes, the shadows fall at wrong angles occasionally. The apartment remembers what it was, and that memory creates persistent, low-level impossibility that the residents will experience forever after. Space once broken doesn't fully heal. Architecture once made impossible retains susceptibility to future impossibility. Room 302 will always be a location where the normal rules apply slightly less reliably than they should. Silent Hill. Origins introduces impossibility through transition. Travis Grady's journey focuses on the mirrors that allow passage between the normal fog world and the other world, and these mirrors reveal something crucial about Silent Hill's impossible spaces. They exist in layers. The normal world and the other world aren't separate locations. They're different states of the same location, occupying identical coordinates while remaining distinctly different environments. When Travis uses a mirror to transition, he's not traveling through space in any conventional sense. He's shifting between spatial states, moving from one layer of reality to another without changing his position. The room he's in remains the same room, same coordinates, same position within the building, but everything about it changes. The walls rust, the lighting dims, the air thickens. The space maintains its geometric identity while transforming its material identity. This reveals that all of Silent Hill's buildings exist in multiple states simultaneously. The hospital Travis explores has a normal state version that's relatively clean and well maintained. It also has an otherworld state version that's corroded and nightmarish. Both states are equally real, equally present, occupying the same spatial coordinates. The hospital is superimposed with itself, existing as multiple versions layered on top of each other, and the mirrors allow perception and presence to shift between layers. The sanitarium in Origins demonstrates this layering explicitly. In the normal state, the sanitarium is empty but intact. Beds in the wards, equipment in the examination rooms, everything present but abandoned. In the otherworld state, the sanitarium is a nightmare of medical experimentation and torture, with equipment designed to hurt rather than heal. Both states are true. The sanitarium was both an ordinary medical facility and a place of horror, and those two truths exist simultaneously in different layers of the same space. The theater in Origins pushes the layering concept further. In the normal state, the theater is a standard performance venue, stage, seating, backstage areas. In the otherworld state, the theater becomes a labyrinth of corridors and chambers that couldn't fit within the building's external dimensions. The otherworld version is spatially expanded compared to the normal version, as if transitioning between layers also transitions between different geometric configurations of the same location. This suggests that the impossible architecture isn't consistent across layers. A building might follow relatively normal geometry in its fog world state, but violate geometry extensively in its otherworld state. The impossibility is layer dependent, state dependent, and transitioning between states means potentially transitioning into or out of geometric violations. The motel in Origins contains a room that's larger in the other world than in the normal world. Travis enters the room in fog world state, gauges its dimensions. Standard motel room, maybe 200 square feet. He uses a mirror to transition to the other world, and the room expands. Same room, same location, but the otherworld version contains easily 400 square feet of space. The walls are farther apart. The ceiling is higher. The room has grown without moving, expanded its internal volume while maintaining the same external dimensions, demonstrating that space itself is layer dependent, that the amount of space in a location isn't fixed, but varies depending on which reality state is being observed. Silent Hill, Homecoming explores impossible architecture through the town of Shepherd's Glen, which isn't Silent Hill proper, but has become infected by Silent Hill's spatial wrongness. The town's church demonstrates this infection clearly. From outside, the church appears normal, standard New England religious architecture, modest size, comprehensible structure. Inside, the church contains a cathedral, not a large interior that's impressive given the building's size, a full cathedral with soaring ceilings, extensive transepts, dozens of side chapels. The interior is impossibly larger than the exterior allows, suggesting that proximity to Silent Hill has enabled Shepherd's Glen's buildings to begin violating geometric principles they previously respected. The underground network beneath Shepherd's Glen is where impossibility becomes explicit. The founding families of the town constructed a series of chambers and corridors for their ritual purposes, and these underground spaces don't follow conventional tunnel architecture. They branch according to symbolic logic rather than practical logic, creating patterns that have meaning to the cult but don't serve any structural purpose. Corridors run parallel when they should intersect. Chambers connect to each other through passages that shouldn't be able to exist given the chamber's relative positions. The family layers each contain a ritual chamber, and these chambers exist in spatial relationships that don't work. The layers are accessed from different locations throughout the town, locations that are miles apart. But underground, the ritual chambers are adjacent, separated by single corridors or single doors. The underground space has compressed, bringing distant locations into proximity, ignoring the intervening geography that should prevent these chambers from being neighbors. Alex Shepard's descent into Silent Hill proper at the end of his journey takes him through a transitional zone where Shepard's Glen's relatively mild spatial wrongness gradually intensifies into Silent Hill's severe violations. The transition isn't abrupt. There's no clear boundary where one town ends and the other begins. Instead, there's a gradient, a region where the architecture becomes progressively more impossible, where corridors stretch longer with each section traversed, where rooms become larger and more distorted gradually rather than suddenly. By the time Alex reaches Silent Hill's church for the final confrontation, he's in a space that doesn't pretend to follow any normal rules. The church's interior is a vast, cavern-like space, all rough stone and organic growth, bearing no resemblance to church architecture except for a few symbolic elements, an altar, a cross, some vestiges of religious identity. The space has consumed the church and converted it into something else while maintaining just enough church characteristics to be recognizable as a corrupted version rather than a replacement. Silent Hill, Downpour explores impossibility through environmental collapse. Murphy Pendleton's journey takes him through locations that are visibly deteriorating, falling apart, revealing the void underneath. Buildings in Downpour don't just violate geometry, they fail structurally while continuing to stand, existing in states of collapse that should result in total destruction but somehow maintain enough integrity to remain navigable. The Devil's Pit, a mining complex Murphy explores, demonstrates this failing but standing state explicitly. The mine shafts are collapsed, the support beams are broken, the entire structure should have caved in on itself, become an impassable ruin of crushed rock and twisted metal, but it hasn't. The collapsed mine shafts are still passable, the broken support beams still support. The structure exists in a state of simultaneous failure and function, maintaining navigability through violation of structural engineering principles. The Otherworld sections in Downpour push this concept to extremes. Murphy navigates through buildings where entire walls are missing, where floors have large sections removed, where ceilings have collapsed. He can see void through these gaps, not basement or street or sky, but empty nothing, absence, space that should have something in it but doesn't. He's navigating through structures that are mostly gone, mostly removed, with only partial floors and partial walls remaining. Yet those partial elements are sufficient to allow traversal because the game's rules have shifted from you need solid structure to walk on to you can walk on whatever fragments remain. The monastery Murphy explores late in his journey contains architecture that's explicitly impossible even by Silent Hill standards. The building contains staircases that lead to nowhere, not to locked doors or blocked passages, but literally to nothing. Staircases that terminate in mid-air, ending at empty space. These aren't incomplete construction. They're complete staircases that simply don't go anywhere, serving no function, existing purely as architectural nonsense. The monastery also contains rooms that are outside the building. You're inside the monastery, navigating through interior corridors, and you enter a room through an interior door, and the room has exterior characteristics: wind, rain, open sky above. You're simultaneously inside the building and outside it, existing in a space that the structure both contains and doesn't contain, demonstrating that inside and outside aren't mutually exclusive states in Silent Hill's impossible architecture. The void section at the game's end makes explicit what's been implicit throughout Downpour, that Silent Hill's impossible architecture exists over a layer of non-existence, that beneath all the streets and buildings is nothing, and sometimes that nothing bleeds through. The void is a space that consists primarily of absence, of empty platforms suspended in darkness with gaps between them. Murphy jumps from platform to platform, each leap carrying him over nothing that extends infinitely downward, and the platforms themselves are fragments, pieces of rooms, sections of corridors, chunks of buildings, all isolated from their original context and suspended in void. Navigation through the void requires accepting that space is no longer continuous. You can't walk from point A to point B because there's literally nothing between them. You have to leap to cross the gaps, to accept that the world has become discontinuous. That space now comes in isolated packets separated by unbridgeable absence. The void is showing what Silent Hill's impossible architecture was always built on: nothing. The town exists over emptiness, and the impossible geometries are maintained only through constant effort that sometimes fails, allowing the void to show through. The cosmic horror of Silent Hill's impossible places lies not in any single architectural violation, but in the cumulative realization they create. The first time a corridor is longer than it should be, you rationalize. You were distracted. You miscounted. Perception is unreliable. The second time, doubt creeps in. The third time, you start wondering if the corridor really is wrong, or if you've lost the ability to gauge distance accurately. By the 20th violation, the 50th, the 100th, you've stopped questioning and started accepting, and that acceptance is the horror. You've been conditioned to tolerate impossible architecture. You navigate through spaces that shouldn't exist without surprise or resistance. You've learned to function in environments that violate the fundamental principles that allow navigation, and that learning has changed you. You can never return to taking geometry for granted. You can never fully trust that a corridor will be the length it appears to be, that a room will contain the space its exterior dimensions suggest, that a staircase will lead where its trajectory implies. This is the deeper horror that Team Silent understood, that sustained exposure to impossible spaces doesn't just frighten you, it recalibrates your entire sense of how reality works. You become someone who knows, at a level deeper than conscious thought, that the rules can break, that space is negotiable, that buildings can be larger inside than outside, that corridors can change length between traversals, that rooms can exist in multiple states simultaneously. And once you know these things, once you've experienced them directly, you carry that knowledge with you always. The real world's architecture starts looking different. You notice when a building's interior feels slightly too large for its exterior. You pause when a corridor seems longer than it should be. You've been marked by exposure to impossible spaces, and that mark changes how you perceive all spaces forever after. Team Silent understood that this transformation of the player was itself an achievement of cosmic horror. The games don't just scare you within their runtime, they alter your relationship with physical space permanently. After spending hours navigating through Silent Hill's impossible architecture, you can't walk through an ordinary building without some small part of your mind checking whether the geometry is behaving properly, whether the distances are consistent, whether the space is really as normal as it appears. This is what the cosmic horror tradition has always been about, not frightening you in the moment, but changing you fundamentally, giving you knowledge that you can never unknow, showing you things about reality that make it impossible to ever feel completely safe in the world again. Lovecraft's characters who glimpse cosmic truth are forever altered by that glimpse. Silent Hill's players who navigate impossible architecture are forever altered by that navigation. The games achieve this through accumulation and consistency. A single impossible corridor in a horror game is a gimmick, easily dismissed as artistic license or technical limitation. But Silent Hill fills entire games with impossible architecture, stacking violation upon violation, creating worlds where wrongness is the norm rather than the exception. By the time you've spent 10 hours navigating spaces that shouldn't exist, you've been thoroughly immersed in impossibility, and that immersion creates lasting psychological effects. Silent Hill, Shattered Memories approaches impossible architecture through a different lens, transformation through freezing. The ice world that Harry navigates isn't just cold, it's a state where reality itself is arrested, suspended, crystallized into configurations that violate normal spatial relationships. When the world freezes, space folds, distances compress, barriers form out of nothing. The ice doesn't simply coat existing structures, it reshapes them, creating new walls, new corridors, new rooms out of crystallized impossibility. The transformation sequences show this explicitly. Harry watches as the environment around him freezes, and the freezing brings changes that go beyond temperature. Walls appear where no walls existed. Doorways seal themselves with ice that couldn't have formed that quickly through natural processes. Corridors that were straight become labyrinthine as ice formations create new paths and block old ones. The ice is rewriting the architecture in real time, using freezing as a mechanism for spatial reconfiguration. The frozen lake that Harry crosses late in the game demonstrates impossibility through ice architecture. The lake's surface has frozen into formations that couldn't occur naturally. Spikes and ridges and barriers rising from the ice in patterns that suggest intentional design rather than random crystallization. These formations create a maze across the lake's surface, forcing navigation through paths that curve and branch according to logic that has nothing to do with how ice forms, and everything to do with creating a specific journey for Harry to traverse. Beneath the ice, shapes move. You can see them through the semi-transparent frozen surface. Figures, possibly human, possibly not, walking beneath the ice as if the lake were solid ground for them while remaining frozen water for Harry above. They're navigating the lake according to different rules. existing in a different relationship with the frozen space, suggesting that the ice world contains multiple overlapping geometries that different entities access differently. The lighthouse at the lake's far edge is the destination, visible from the shore, appearing to be maybe a mile away. The journey across the frozen lake to reach it takes far longer than a mile walk should take. The distance keeps expanding, the lighthouse receding as Harry approaches, maintaining visual size and distance despite his forward progress. The frozen lake is stretching, extending its surface area while Harry traverses it, keeping the lighthouse perpetually unreachable until the narrative requires his arrival. When he finally reaches the lighthouse and enters it, the interior is impossibly vast. Lighthouses are tall but narrow structures. Their footprint is small, dictated by the circular tower design. This lighthouse's interior contains rooms spreading laterally for distances that the narrow tower couldn't accommodate. The lighthouse is demonstrating the same impossible interiority as other Silent Hill structures, but the violation is more obvious here because lighthouses have such constrained, iconic forms. There's no ambiguity about how much space a lighthouse tower should contain, which makes the excess space undeniable. The staircase spiraling up through the lighthouse operates according to the same impossible elevation principles as other Silent Hill staircases. Harry climbs for what feels like hundreds of vertical feet, ascending far higher than the lighthouse's exterior height allows. When he finally reaches the top chamber and looks out through the windows, he's at an elevation that shouldn't be accessible, looking down on the town from an impossible vantage point that reveals geography the lighthouse's actual height couldn't reveal. The therapy sessions that punctuate shattered memories add another layer to the impossible architecture by suggesting that everything Harry experiences might be constructed, not metaphorically constructed as psychological projection, but literally constructed as spatial manifestation of Cheryl's memories and grief. The town Harry navigates might not be a real location that's become corrupted. It might be a space that's being actively generated in real time, assembled from Cheryl's recollections and emotions, creating architecture that exists only for the duration of the therapy session and only in the configuration her consciousness requires. This reframes all the impossibilities. If the spaces are being generated rather than discovered, then of course they don't follow normal rules. They're not constrained by physics or geometry because they're not physical structures. They're cognitive structures given temporary spatial presence, and cognitive structures don't have to obey the laws that govern material reality. Harry is navigating through someone else's memory space, and memory space is inherently fluid, unstable, prone to the kinds of distortions and impossibilities that characterize dreams. But even this explanation doesn't make the spaces less impossible or less horrifying. Being trapped in someone else's memory made spatial is its own nightmare. You're navigating through architecture that exists only because someone is thinking it into existence. And when they stop thinking about it, the architecture will vanish. You're dependent on another consciousness for the ground beneath your feet, for the walls that define your environment, for the fundamental spatial relationships that allow navigation. That dependency creates existential horror that transcends simple architectural wrongness. Silent Hill, Book of Memories approaches impossibility through procedural generation and abstraction. The dungeons that players navigate are explicitly not attempting to represent real locations. They're abstract spaces, corridors, and rooms arranged in randomly generated configurations that prioritize gameplay over architectural plausibility. This might seem like it removes the cosmic horror of impossible places, but it actually intensifies it by making the impossibility explicit and undeniable. The dungeons exist in a void space, floating platforms suspended over darkness. You can see the edges where the floor ends and the abyss begins. The rooms connect to each other through doorways, but there's no structure surrounding or supporting the rooms. They're isolated chambers hanging in nothing, with only the doorways providing connections. This creates the disturbing sense that you're navigating through a space that's being assembled, one room at a time as you progress, with each room manifesting only when you're about to enter it and possibly vanishing behind you after you leave. The top down camera angle in Book of Memories serves a specific function in conveying impossibility. It lets you see the void beneath the floors, the endless darkness that extends infinitely downward. You're constantly aware that the spaces you're walking through are suspended over nothing, that there's no ground beneath them, no foundation supporting them. They exist through some mechanism that has nothing to do with conventional architecture or structural engineering. The zones shift aesthetic radically from one to the next: fire caverns, contemporary rooftops, organic corridors made of pulsing flesh. But they all share the same underlying impossible structure: rooms floating in void, connected by doorways that bridge nothingness. The aesthetic changes, but the fundamental spatial wrongness remains constant, suggesting that all of these environments are variations on a single theme: spaces that exist without ground, without support, without any of the infrastructure that normally makes buildings possible. The randomly generated nature means that the layout changes each time you play. The same zone will have a completely different configuration on subsequent visits. Rooms that were connected before are now separated. Corridors that ran straight now branch at different angles. The space is unstable at a fundamental level, unable or unwilling to maintain consistent geography across iterations. This instability is itself a form of impossibility. Real spaces don't reconfigure themselves between visits, but these spaces do, demonstrating that they're operating according to rules where stability is optional rather than mandatory. PT, the playable teaser for the canceled Silent Hills project, distills impossible architecture down to its purest essence: the looping corridor. The entire experience takes place in a single L-shaped hallway that you traverse repeatedly, exiting through a door at one end and immediately re-entering through the same door at the other end. It's the Mobius strip of horror architecture, a space that contains its own entrance and exit at the same location, creating a loop that should be impossible but functions perfectly. The corridor is completely mundane in its details: residential hallway, apartment doors, basic lighting, nothing outwardly strange, but the impossibility lies in its behavior. You walk down the corridor, counting your steps, gauging the distance, maybe 30 feet from entrance to exit. You go through the door and emerge at the entrance again, having somehow returned to your starting point despite walking in a straight line away from it. The corridor is spatially recursive, folded back on itself in a way that allows continuous forward motion to result in circular return. With each loop, the corridor changes slightly. New details appear, lighting shifts, objects move. The changes accumulate, transforming the mundane hallway into something increasingly disturbing while maintaining its basic architectural identity. You're walking through the same space repeatedly, but it's not the same space. It's evolving, deteriorating, becoming progressively more hostile with each iteration. The bathroom provides the focal point for the impossible architecture's most direct manifestation. It's a small room off the main corridor, and during certain loops you can enter it. The bathroom appears normal size from the doorway, standard fixtures, maybe 40 square feet total. But once you're inside and the door closes, the space feels larger. Not measurably larger in ways you could point to specific expansion, but psychologically larger, oppressively larger, as if the bathroom is pressing outward against your perception while maintaining its physical dimensions. Lisa, the ghost that haunts the corridor, demonstrates impossible spatial relationships through her appearances. She materializes behind you when you were certain nothing was behind you. She vanishes when you look directly at her, but reappears in your peripheral vision. She's violating the principle that objects occupy consistent locations. She's treating space as fluid, navigable in ways that let her appear and disappear without traversing the distances between. The corridor is allowing her this mobility, or perhaps she's operating according to rules where the corridor's layout is merely a suggestion rather than a constraint. The most disturbing aspect of PT's corridor is its infinity. You're trapped in this loop with no exit, walking the same 30 feet over and over, and the repetition creates a unique form of claustrophobia. You're not enclosed in a small space. You have a full corridor to walk through, but you're enclosed in a limited set of coordinates, unable to access anywhere beyond this specific location. And that limitation combined with the infinite repetition creates psychological horror that goes beyond simple confinement. The corridor is both finite and infinite simultaneously. It contains a measurable, walkable distance that you can cross in seconds, but it extends infinitely through time because you can never escape it, can never reach anywhere beyond it. It's infinite in the sense that it can be traversed infinitely many times without ever accessing anything external to itself. The corridor has become a universe unto itself, a complete spatial system that contains nothing but its own 30-foot length repeated endlessly. When you finally solve the puzzles and trigger the ending, when Lisa manifests fully and you're pulled into the final confrontation, the corridor's impossibility reaches its climax. The space contracts and expands simultaneously. The walls close in while also receding. You're trapped in a space that's too small to move in and too large to escape from, experiencing contradictory spatial states at the same time. PT achieves in minutes what other games take hours to achieve: the complete breakdown of reliable geometry, the transformation of space into something hostile and unknowable. The significance of PT's corridor extends beyond its own content. It represents the ultimate refinement of Silent Hill's impossible architecture philosophy. Strip away everything except the pure essence of spatial wrongness. Focus entirely on one simple space made impossible through repetition and subtle transformation. The corridor doesn't need to be a vast labyrinth or an impossibly large building. It just needs to be a space that doesn't behave the way spaces should behave. And that misbehavior creates all the horror necessary. The influence of Silent Hill's impossible architecture can be traced through horror gaming history. Games that followed borrowed specific techniques: the corridors that stretch longer than they should, the buildings larger inside than outside, the spaces that reconfigure between visits. But few captured the full cosmic horror of it the way Team Silent did, because capturing that horror requires commitment to accumulation. You can't just have one impossible corridor and expect it to carry the same weight. You need dozens of impossible corridors, rooms, buildings, streets, all violating geometry consistently enough that players can't rationalize them away. The architectural impossibilities in Silent Hill serve multiple narrative and thematic purposes simultaneously. On the practical level, they create gameplay challenges. Navigation becomes difficult when space doesn't behave reliably, which increases tension and extends playtime. On the aesthetic level, they create visual interest. Buildings that violate normal architecture look strange and memorable in ways that standard buildings don't. But on the deepest level, the impossible architecture serves to communicate that Silent Hill is fundamentally other, not just a dangerous place or a haunted place, but a place that operates according to different rules. The monsters can be explained through supernatural intervention, demons, ghosts, manifestations. The fog can be rationalized as weather or supernatural obscurement, but architecture that violates geometry, that can't be explained away. That requires accepting that the fundamental fabric of reality works differently in Silent Hill, that physics and math and space itself are negotiable within the town's boundaries. This positions Silent Hill as a location of cosmic significance. It's not simply that bad things happened here and left spiritual residue. It's that the town exists at a point where reality is thin, where the rules that govern existence elsewhere don't fully apply, where consciousness and matter can interact directly. The town is a wound in the fabric of space, and the impossible architecture is that wound made visible and navigable. The psychological impact on players mirrors the psychological impact on characters. Harry, James, Heather, Henry, Travis, all of them are changed by their time in Silent Hill's impossible spaces. They can never return to taking reality for granted. They've experienced directly that buildings don't have to work the way buildings are supposed to work, that corridors can stretch and rooms can expand and distances can change, and that knowledge reshapes their entire relationship with physical space. Players experience the same transformation after completing a Silent Hill game, after spending hours navigating through its impossible architecture. You carry that experience with you. When you walk through a real building, some part of your mind is checking the geometry, verifying that the corridors are the length they appear to be, that rooms contain the space their exteriors suggest, that everything is behaving normally. You've been taught to be suspicious of space itself, to question whether the physical world is really as stable as you always assumed. This is the ultimate achievement of Silent Hill's impossible places. They don't just frighten you, they educate you in cosmic horror. They teach you that reality is more fragile than you thought, that the rules can break, that space itself is not the reliable framework you assumed it was. They give you knowledge that changes you permanently, that makes you see the world differently, that introduces doubt into every spatial experience for the rest of your life. And that education, that permanent alteration of your perception, is precisely what cosmic horror has always been about. It's not about monsters jumping out to scare you. It's about showing you truths that make it impossible to ever feel completely safe again. Truths about how reality works or doesn't work that undermine your confidence in the stability of existence itself. Silent Hill's impossible places accomplish this perfectly. They take the most mundane environments, schools, hospitals, apartments, streets, and reveal that even these familiar spaces can become impossible. If a hospital corridor can stretch longer than it should, if an apartment can be larger inside than outside, if a street can lead somewhere other than where its trajectory suggests, then nowhere is safe. No space can be trusted. The comfortable familiarity of architecture, the sense that buildings are reliable and comprehensible, has been destroyed. And once that sense is destroyed, it can never be fully restored. You can finish the game, turn off the console, return to the real world, but you'll carry the knowledge with you. You'll remember that spaces can be impossible. You'll wonder occasionally whether the room you're in is really the size it appears to be, whether the corridor you're walking down is really leading where it seems to lead, whether the architecture around you is really as stable as it looks. This lingering doubt This permanent slight uncertainty about space itself is the true cosmic horror of Silent Hill's impossible places. Not the fear you feel while playing, but the mark it leaves on your perception afterward. The games teach you to be suspicious of reality, and that lesson never fully fades. Close your eyes now, if you'd like. Think about the room you're in. Are you certain it's the size it appears to be? Are you certain the walls are where they seem to be? Are you certain that if you walked to the door and measured the distance, it would match the distance you perceive? You probably are certain, but that certainty isn't quite as solid as it was before. There's a tiny seed of doubt now, planted by hours spent navigating spaces that didn't behave the way spaces should behave. That seed will stay with you, growing almost imperceptibly, creating a thin layer of uncertainty that colors every spatial experience you have from this point forward. That's the cosmic horror of impossible places. Not that they exist in Silent Hill, but that having experienced them, you can never be entirely sure they don't exist everywhere. Reality has become negotiable, space has become uncertain, and you'll spend the rest of your life in rooms and corridors and buildings, always with that tiny whisper of doubt, asking whether the geometry is really what it appears to be, or whether perhaps, just possibly, the architecture around you is doing something impossible that you simply haven't noticed yet. The impossible places of Silent Hill have taught you to question everything, and now, awake or asleep, walking through the real world or through dreams, you'll carry that question with you always. Sleep well.